My watch says 7, so we'll start. And welcome everyone to tonight, and good to see you all here. And this is the third session in our October series on searching for an authentic Christian witness. As we start, we acknowledge that we meet on Kaurna land, and we pay our respects to Kaurna and other First Nations elders who have cared for this land for over 60,000 years. We celebrate the fact that First Nations peoples in Australia are part of the oldest living culture in the world, and we commit to walking together in a spirit of reconciliation. Tonight's presenter is Christy Capper, Reverend Dr. Christy Capper, who's the Director of Missiology at the Uniting College of Leadership and Theology. Prior to coming to South Australia, Christy was involved in a range of employment opportunities in New South Wales and Victoria, including on-campus missional roles engaged in evangelism, discipleship and leadership training, working as a youth and young adults minister, and managing a residence for approximately 50 female international students. I think that would have been quite a job. Christy was ordained in the Anglican Church in 2015 and moved to Adelaide in 2016 to take up the position as Director of Missiology. In 2019, she completed her doctoral thesis considering the theological imperative to authentic selfhood and proposing a theological definition of authentic selfhood. And when I was talking to Christy during the week, I said, "What is all that?" And she said, "You'll hear on Thursday night," so I really can't tell you anymore. Christy is very well qualified, I'm sure, to speak on tonight's topic: how authentic selfhood is key to Christian mission. And so I'll now invite Christy to bring us her presentation.
Thank you. I also want to pay my respects to the Kaurna people on whose lands we are living, we are learning, and we're doing all sorts of things, and give thanks to them for all of the work that they have done in the land, and just acknowledge that this is land that was never really seated where we stand today. So thank you for having me. This is a good topic for me because, as you have heard, it's the topic that I did my doctoral study on, so it saves me a bit of research because I've already done that. So I came to Adelaide in 2016 from Melbourne, and before that from Sydney. So I seem to have come here just in time to escape from COVID. So I'm very pleased with that forethought, which allows us to be here together tonight. So one of the reasons that I am passionate about this topic and excited to speak on it is because of a lot of the work that I have done before in my life, before I came to studying and learning about theology. I grew up in a Christian household. My mum was a lay minister in the church and my dad was an ordained minister in the church. So kind of surrounded by churchy things. They sent us kids to a state school because they wanted us to learn about normal people. Because the people that we're around are not that normal. So I'm forever grateful to them that they did that, and that I wasn't sort of brought up in the Christian bubble that is so easy to be brought up in when you're living on site at a campus that trains people for ministry. So when I went to university, I got involved in one of the Christian groups on campus, and I am forever grateful that I did. Even though my theology has moved on from what it was at that particular time, the things that I learned I hold very dear and have made me who I am. I'm not sure that I would still be a person who calls myself a Christian if I hadn't got involved in that group. And one of the things that I found as I was involved as a student and then later as a staff member on campus was that people wanted to be able to be who they were. And that often people felt like they couldn't do that in Christian environments. So when it finally came time for me to think about doing a doctorate in theology, a time that we all know, I'm sure, we all get to that point, don't we? No, just me. Again, doesn't matter. Oh, there we go. I started to think about looking at the topic of authenticity. And it came about because I was reading something that Philip Hughes wrote. He interviewed, you may be familiar with his work, he interviewed a whole bunch of people and kind of came back with some studies. So in his book, Shaping Australian Spirituality, he talks about the idea that young adults, who at that time, my generation, so the group that is now somewhere between 27 and 40, so they still young adults, in the Uniting Church probably. Speaking of young adults, I last year passed out of the youth membership in the Uniting Church, and it was about 2 months after that I got a call to come and speak to you fine people. So it seems like, I feel like I skipped a session. But young adults in Australia said they saw one of the greatest sins that a person could commit as not being authentic, as being inauthentic. And I thought that's really interesting, and I want to explore that more. Because there's often a gap, isn't there, between what we say and what we do. And that's something that people have particularly noticed in the church, with things like the Royal Commission, with things like abuse scandals, hearing about domestic abuse in particular places, and all of the things that happen in the church. And so I actually start off my doctorate talking about, and it gets political, but Scott Morrison's little thing that apparently he has on his desk of a boat and a plaque that says, "I stopped these." Here is a man who says, "I'm a Christian," and yet he has a trophy that he got made talking about how he stopped the boats. What does it mean to be an authentic Christian and an authentic person in the midst of these things that often seem to clash? And sometimes authenticity does clash. So Charles Taylor talks about the idea of this period of time. In his book, A Secular Age, he calls this period the age of authenticity. And he writes a very big chapter that most people might consider a book within a very large book about that. Authenticity is something that values both individuality and self-expression. And because of those things, sometimes it can be frowned upon by different groups. And I want to share with you some of the perceptions that I've found, and people I've spoken to have found, in terms of authenticity and the Christian church. So there's often perceptions in the church that the church encourages uniformity rather than diversity. That we'd like people to come in and sit down and stay still and do what they're supposed to do. And we'd like people to live a certain way, our way, please, ways that make us most comfortable, ways that go most with our tradition. And in some ways, that's okay. But when we talk about the idea that we welcome everybody, it becomes a bit of a clash. I often have found that for many people that I talk to who identify as LGBTIQ+, they feel like the church isn't necessarily a safe place for them. A lot of people in society feel like the church isn't necessarily a safe place for their children because of the things that have happened in the church. And a lot of women feel like the church isn't a safe place for them. I don't collar up often, but when I do, I often find women who are quite surprised and excited that there's a woman who's ordained. And of course, we know that there's many women who are ordained, but the denominations that most often collar up are ones that may not necessarily ordain women to the same extent. And so the perception in the public is that that's not necessarily happening. So the other perception, you've probably heard this, it's not a safe place necessarily to express an opinion or a doubt. And if authenticity is about self-expression, about individuality, about asking questions that are on your heart, then that's a difficult place to be in. In his book, The Spirituality Revolution, David Tacey, who was a lecturer at La Trobe University, interviewed all of these first-year university students over a number of years. And a guy who he names Danny says, "We're now in a state very similar to the state of the church when Jesus was alive." Now, of course, Danny doesn't realise that there wasn't actually a church when Jesus was alive. I think that what he's talking about is the Jewish community. He says it's elite and devoid of the Holy Spirit and hierarchical. And that's the perception that a lot of people in my generation have of what the church looks like and what the church is willing to do. Not willing to engage in dialogue with younger adults about what the Spirit might be doing in the world at this time. So sometimes the authenticity gap can make it really difficult for us in mission, because there's these perceptions that we are not open to people like that. So how has theology dealt with the topic of authenticity then? Surely if authenticity is something that's coming up in our culture, it's something that theologians are dealing with, right? Well, you'd think so, but in my many years of research, I didn't find much at all. So a lot of theologians seem to just decide not to deal with the concept. So often you'll find that they just dismiss it as either saying it's unhelpful or it's not relevant. Brian Rosner, who actually I know quite well, we used to go to church together. I'm friends with his daughter, so when I critique him, know that it's done in love. I think he's wrong, but you know, I'll also sit and have a drink with him. He says that authenticity is superseded by this new self that we put on in Christ. I was talking to him about my thesis one time. He goes, "Oh, it's all in Paul." And I'm like, but is it though? Is it all in Paul? And he says that authenticity is strongly associated with self-interest and selfishness. It's my license to do whatever I want to do, and that's inherently not a godly thing. And so as theologians, we really just shouldn't bother with it. Someone who's not a theologian, but that theologians seem to often reference, is a man named Andrew Potter, who wrote the book The Authenticity Hoax. And his basic thesis in the end is that authenticity doesn't actually exist. Now, we could question the existence of anything really if we wanted to, and many philosophers have and do. But this idea that authenticity is the search for a golden period that never existed, that never will, and we should all just stop talking about it really. And I think that's fundamentally unhelpful for us if we want to engage in a society that values authenticity. When people say it's one of the highest values, when they see inauthenticity as a great sin, it's not something that the church, it's not something that theologians can just ignore. It's something that is precious to people, and if we are people after God's heart, we ought to think carefully about it before we do whatever we do with it. So, I'm going to add a couple of points in time, and this is one of them, so get ready. Get you to talk in groups of, I have 3 written down. Now I wrote down 3 because 4 seems like too many, and in 2, you can sometimes get awkward silences. If you're comfortable with awkward silences, or you really like the person next to you and nobody else, feel free to go with 2. You are adults, do whatever you like. But in small groups, I would like you to think about the question, why might the church be hesitant to embrace the concept of authenticity? And I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and then if you're happy to share with the larger group.
Christy,
I'll just check with the code with Marshall about how you talk through your mask.
take your mask off, please.
Have
Yeah. Well, I know I knew it, but I've heard it. I wasn't actually personal. But yeah, part of the dilemma of tradition is that if you just listen to your inner self, you know, original sense can control your life. Whereas you've got to listen to another voice, the voice of Christ. That happens and all the things that change you, so you become a Christian, not just a human. There's a whole history of original authenticity. Could be misleading, could lead you astray. Original sin, you see, that means it's there. What your sin is, what's in you, who you really are, that's what you're going to do.
Just one more minute, so make sure that everyone has had a chance to say something.
I'm just simply saying that one tradition, but who you really are, who your true self is, that's an important question.
The church generally. Many different religions.
Oh, don't you think so? It's part of the tradition.
What did people come up with in that short period of time?
Spiritual ideal world.
Is there anyone who's really wanting to share first? Is there anyone who's not wanting to share first but willing to share first?
How do you cope with authenticity in the college setting?
That is a good question. I'm going to think about that one. We can hold that for questions at the end once we've gone through it more. Yeah, that's good.
Authentic people might whiz off in all sorts of directions that we don't particularly like.
Yeah, they might be harder to control.
There's a microphone.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
That was me, I was asleep at the wheel.
Thanks. Yeah.
So,
who's next? Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I learned something in our group.
Oh, good.
Jonathan was talking about Bultmann's great theme was authenticity, which I never heard about before.
That's true. Bultmann and Heidegger both spoke a lot about authenticity in a slightly different way to how it's spoken about in younger adults today, which is why I haven't used lots of Bultmann's work. But yeah, it's good.
So what was wrong with Bultmann?
So many things. But no, just he was not as helpful for me for my work in terms of thinking about authentic selfhood in the way that he approached the area.
here we go.
Sorry. And that raised for me the issue of how are we defining authenticity? And as my good friend here reminded me, we've had all this series all this year, and I'm on the next to last one, and I'm now questioning the word authentic. Can you actually disconnect it for other words like integrity and so on? So that was the issue I raised.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I'm going to do is lead you towards the or show you the definition that I came up with in my doctorate work. So, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Oh, anyone else? Last one? Yes, sorry.
We had an interesting one. It's about the dynamism of being a Christian. There's transmutation involved. So authenticity sounds like there's an end point from which you cannot pass.
Yeah, that's great, and that comes into the definition too. Thank you, that's great. Last one.
Just simply that our group said the church is hesitant because it has problems with the real world.
With the normal people. Yeah. These are some of the ones that that I came up with, and I found this, just thought it was funny. Yes, sorry.
My version of Jonathan's, but it was my version of Jonathan's real word was science. That it's too much like understanding the fundamental nature of matter.
Yep. So some of the ones that I was thinking about were the difficulty of diversity within large institutions and organisations, which the church is. And that can be difficult when you've got people asking questions and doing things differently. It's much easier to have people all doing the same thing or on the same sort of line. The other is the question of power. I'm a little bit cynical. Sorry, I don't know if you can tell that. The question of power in the church. If we talk about inauthenticity as sin, well, the church can't really say necessarily what is authentic. All of a sudden, something that might be a good thing for you to do might be a bad thing for me to do, because we're actually different, rather than having, a blanket set of what we should do. That's not to say there aren't any ethical guidelines, but that perhaps ethics has its own sense of relativity in some areas. People are busy, they don't want to look at every passing fad. Sometimes it's hard to work out what is a passing fad and what is not. And it means that maybe people won't conform to understandings that we've had about particular issues that are at the heart of some of the church's biggest arguments at the moment. And that is a very stressful thing for people who are in leadership and trying to keep things together. So it's interesting, as I have gone through my thesis, and people say to you when you're studying, what are you studying, what are you looking at? I've had church leaders, and particularly I'll say bishops, because that takes it out of the United Church context, say to me, why would you look at that? All the answers are in the Bible. And the Bible's great. I'm a systematic theologian. The Bible is my primary source material. But there's other sources that I use as well. And I've had other friends, particularly those in the LGBTIQ community, cry when I tell them what I'm studying and say, I feel like I can't be authentic in my community. And that actually stops us from engaging with people. So, it can be a difficult thing. Amy Poehler talks about the idea in her book, I've forgotten what her book is called, Yes Please, it's a great book, the actress Amy Poehler, but she talks about the idea that it's good for her but not for me. And she's particularly talking about women fighting about who should be at home and who should be at work, and the working mums versus the stay-at-home mums. But she says, sometimes what is good for this person is not what's good for me. And in some ways, being authentic means that what is good for some of us is not necessarily good for others of us, because we are different people. So in his book, The Spirituality Revolution, David Tacey says, religious adults who have little or no contact with youth may protest that religion is perfectly good as it stands and see no need to make any accommodation to contemporary experience. But religious adults who are closer to the grassroots of society recognise the ever-present need of religion, to reinterpret itself for the rising generations, lest it lose its efficacy and meaning. This work of renewal and interpretation is inspired by the Spirit, in whom everything else is made new, and in whom the eternal Word is made accessible to the contemporary generations. Which reminds me of Tillich, who of course talked about how we need to reinterpret and revitalize and re-look at the Christian faith in each generation in order to make it most accessible to that particular group. So, as we think about defining authenticity, it sounds like something easy. I started working on my doctorate thinking I'm going to look at inauthenticity as a theology of sin. That's what I'm going to look at. And within about 3 months, I worked out that I needed a definition of authenticity to do that, and there wasn't really one that was good. And so instead, I spent the next few years working on one. But it's sort of defining the indefinable. You know, biblical scholars talk about authenticity, and what they mean is that manuscript of Mark actually a Markan manuscript? It's sort of a binary thing. It either is or it isn't. But with people, it's a bit different, because what is authentic to us at one stage of life as we grow and we change will not be authentic to us at another stage of life. That's not to say there'll necessarily be a complete disconnect, because being the same person, we need to be recognisable as the same person. But if you think about the fact that, you know, every cell of your body is changing, you are literally not the person you were 10 years ago, it's not surprising that as we think about authenticity as a person, we do grow and change. It can't be a binary thing. And it also can't necessarily be something that people can judge easily from the outside all the time, because they don't see everything that's going on. So here are some people just talking about the difficulty of defining authenticity. Mariana Ashana talks about the term authenticity being used with such frequency and such confidence in discussing the autonomy of persons that few of us have stopped to consider what is actually meant by the term. It flies around everywhere, it's getting used by everyone, but no one is actually willing to say this is what it means. Lionel Trilling, very promising. The term may well resist definition. I was not encouraged when I read that. And then Charles Taylor, in his book, The Ethics of Authenticity, says the struggle ought not be over authenticity, for or against it, which is often what many people are arguing about, but about defining its proper meaning. Because of course you can't really argue for or against something unless you have a common definition of what that something is. So I've done a lot of work, and I thought I'd hand it over to you and ask you, how would you define authenticity? Or perhaps the easier question, what kind of words do you associate when you think about authenticity? What are other words that you might think about in that way? So take a couple of minutes with that same group, unless you really didn't like them, and then find another group, but try not to look like you're finding another group.
If you run somewhere else, I'll understand. Not having to follow someone else.
changes from when you're a child, when you're 90, you relate differently to situations.
Being prepared to look at just be cool, get it.
Relationships genuine nature.
About 1 more minute. I know I had many years, but you have 1 more minute.
Because if you hear other people's point of view, you might change it.
Transparency over against hypocrisy.
Alright. Fergus, are you ready? Come back and share with the group. Does anyone have something that they are dying to say? Want to get in first? Yes, over here.
Have you got your hand up, old chap? Yep. There we go.
Being true to oneself.
Well done.
And replacement.
We actually asked the question, what would Jesus say? And I think what he would say, or we thought, he would say, don't be a hypocrite.
Yep.
That authentic is opposite to being a hypocrite.
Yep. Nice.
We had lots of others, but
That's the one you liked.
Yeah.
Nice. I like it.
So you talked a little bit about, because authentic is so hard to think about, so what is inauthentic? What does that mean to be inauthentic?
Yep.
So I was thinking about how we all grow over our lifetime and develop and change, and perhaps to be inauthentic is to still subscribe to a position we might have held when we were 10, when we were like 50 or 60 and our life is much richer. Maybe that's inauthentic, and we need to grow and accommodate our new experiences.
Yep. So not growing. Yep.
There's words like staying centered with oneself, and the word Yahweh comes to mind in its meaning of I am who I am, I will be who I will be, and how do we engage with that center?
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. So this lines.
One of those was being prepared to listen, because then you might change something about yourself that is different.
Nice. That goes in nicely with the idea of those that don't grow. That's cool. Any last burning things? No? Okay, good. So some of the things, some of the general ideas that people have come up with are along these lines. So the idea that authenticity is something that exists within self-acceptance and self-creation. Because as people, to be authentic, there has to be some sort of acceptance of this is who I am. But there also needs to be an acknowledgement that there can be continued growth. Have you ever heard someone say sort of obnoxiously, this is just who I am? That may be true, but it is a cop-out. There's also the ability to grow, the ability to change. It also needs to be found in relationship with other people. So we are social people. We are made in the image of a God who is Trinity. So to be authentic, we need to be in relationship with others, to allow them to be helping to shape up us as well. And to also realise that our within the idea of self-acceptance, self-shaping, and even the idea of identity, we need others around us to go, oh, that's interesting, I am different to you. You know, like toddlers when they walk around asking really inappropriate questions about different people and the parts they may or may not have. What are they doing? They're trying to work out, are you a boy or a girl? Are you like me? Are you different to me? It is awkward in the supermarket though, I will acknowledge that. So we need others around who are similar to us, who are different to us, so that we can work out where we fit in and where we stand. Charles Taylor talks about the idea of identity as understanding where I stand, and that it's from there that we can work out who we are. It involves being true to ourselves, whatever that means, and also working out what things are of value to us and building a life around them. Because I'm sure we've all met people who say they really, really value something, but then don't live or act as if they actually value that. So authenticity is about those two things starting to line up. It's a truthfulness in word and deed. It requires that we have an idea of who we are, that there's some sort of level of self-awareness. To be authentic, we need to have some sort of self-awareness about who we are. And also requires a commitment to something that is bigger than ourselves. Now, that last one can sometimes be a little bit controversial, but the reason that I say that, and that others such as Charles Taylor say this, is because otherwise it becomes narcissism. Taylor talks about the idea that there are deviant forms of authenticity that mostly centre around narcissism. You know, this is just who I am. You put up with it. You deal with it. I'm going to do whatever I want to do and whatever I feel like doing. Well, you are not just a feeling person, you're a logical person as well. You're hopefully an emotive person, caring about other people. So whatever you feel like doing is not necessarily the authentic thing to do, because we are whole people. So, one of the people that I found very useful, who learned a lot from Bultmann and translated Being in Time by Heidegger, is John Macquarie. Have people read some of John Macquarie's work? Anybody?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's good. Most people, when I talk to people my age, they're like, who? Was he related to Governor Macquarie? different people, different types.
A good Anglican.
Good Anglican, he was. Although there is debate about whether he only became an Anglican because he wanted a certain thing, but that's fine, that's fine. We all want positions at Oxford, and if that's what gets... No, I'm kidding. So he says, a person exists authentically when their original possibilities belonging to their being as a person are fulfilled. Their existence is inauthentic when their possibilities are projected on something alien to themselves. In that case, the self is lost and scattered. In their even their original possibilities may be lost or rendered inaccessible. That is fallenness. To restore authenticity would mean to unify the scattered self so that it's withdrawn from false concerns and stands in its original possibilities. Now, that sounds complicated, but for Macquarie, he likes the idea of potentiality and possibilities. One of the things that he keeps talking about is the idea that becoming who we are, becoming fully human, becoming, if you like, authentic, is about actualising the potentialities that we have. And each of us has sort of a different set of potentialities that God has given us. And it's about actualising those. So those original possibilities, those potentialities, being able to be fulfilled. He also talks about the difficulty of being authentic within that. We can probably all relate to that. And the idea of a unity of self. I used in some of my work ideas of narrative identity theory, if anyone's familiar with that, but the idea that there needs to be a consistency in who we are, that our identity is sort of one whole. That's one small part of it. But this idea of unity of self. So we are not just different fragmented people. We are the same person where we go to different places. People would recognise who we are if they met us in different settings. But also the idea that we cannot completely cut off from our past. Because even when we try, we're reacting to that past and it's not completely cut off. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And who we're born into is not a blank page. We are born into a context, into a particular time, into a particular place. We are not blank pages on which to be written. There is a story that goes on before us, and that there's a story that will go on after us. And that story, the one before us, shapes who we are. And the one that goes on afterwards will shape in some ways how we're remembered. So, after many, many tries on my whiteboard, I came up with this definition of authenticity. Wait for it. We might have to actually click. I don't think I've turned it off accidentally.
Just go to the next one.
Yeah, that's it. So my definition of authenticity is that authenticity is to bring the fullness, thank you, of one's unique, God-inspired self to life. Now, that sounds reasonably simple, but it's actually got, I make that definition known in chapter 7 of my thesis, and then explain how it fits into everything that I had explained in the 6 chapters previously that it rests on. We have not had the benefit of going through those, the curse, I'm not sure, of going through those 6 chapters together tonight. So we're going to just jump in. So the idea that it's to bring the fullness of one's God-inspired self to life, and if I can have the next slide, that would be great.
This is working.
Oh, how exciting. Maybe it just didn't like me. Technology does that sometimes. It's the idea that we are all created in the image of God. And the realization that being created in the Imago Dei is both an actuality, it's something that we are, but it's also something that we live into. And Aquinas talked about this a little bit, the idea that we are made in the image of God and we will be in the image of God. It is there, but it's not fully revealed yet. We don't always live it out. Athanasius talked about the image of God like being an old portrait, and the old portrait had dirt and all sorts of things over it, and it needed to be refreshed and be repainted so that we know what it looks like. And he talks about that being why Jesus came, so that we can actually see what God is like through that. So think about it as it's there, but maybe it's a bit hidden, or there's a bit of grime in the way and we can't see it properly. So the idea of the unique God-inspired self is also about the continual move of the Spirit. So John McCrory talks about the idea of letting be. And often when we think about God letting something be, we think, leave it alone. That's how we tend to use it in English. But McCrory talks about it as enabling to be. If God is the supreme existence, the supreme being, then letting be is a creative process that actually empowers something to exist. And so this idea that we are continually becoming, continually changing, and that God is letting us be is kind of nice. It's better than just left alone and over there somewhere forgot about it. And then of course uniqueness is something that's really important. It's essential to being human. So Janet Suskas says that to be fully human, even to praise God, we need others who are different to ourselves. We need others who do things differently, others who act differently. And sometimes that can be really challenging because that's not nice when others are different. But we need that. And of course the image of God is something that is both individual and communal. So when we are not the people that God creates us to be, other people actually miss out on part of the picture of who God is. And then this idea of bringing something to life. Means allowing oneself to be brought to life, so actualizing that potentiality that is there. It's not a complete self-understanding, but it's bringing who we understand ourselves to be to life. So we are never going to understand ourselves fully in this life. We are never going to see all of those bits and pieces, which is why we also need others around us to point them out. But as we know and understand ourselves, being that person, it's also built on the idea that identity is something that's constructed rather than simply given. So there are some parts, as we talked about, the blank page, there are some parts that are given, some parts of the story that are already written, some parts of the story that we don't have that much control over. But it's also something that we can grow and change into who we are and who we want to be. We're continually becoming. And it's also participating in our own self-creation of who we are, and that continual change and continual growth. John McCrory actually talks about the idea that it's in self-creation that we are most in the image of God, because God is a creative God, and as we kind of have the consciousness and the self-awareness to stand back and create self, as well as engage in creation as a whole, we stand in that image of God as a creative God. There is, of course, a problem with actualizing potentiality. You can't do everything. I don't know if you've tried. I've tried at different points. It's not possible. Don't believe them when they tell you you can have it all. It doesn't work that way. You can't be married and single at the same time, for example. It doesn't really work legally or in any other way. So in order to actualize some potentialities, we need to surrender others. So in order to say yes to some things, we need to say no to others. And not every potentiality is necessarily going to get actualized. And sometimes that can be annoying. My sister, my first degree was in history, and my sister was so good at history in high school. Like, I was really jealous. She did really well, better than me, and that's what I did in uni. And she ended up becoming a scientist. What a waste. But apparently not, because she chose to engage some potentialities that are different to what I would have done. So how is it that we choose what potentialities to actualize and what not to? Well, again, with Macquarie, he talks about this idea that all through his writings, he talks about the need to actualize potentiality, that that's what we have to do. And then there's this one part in one of his books where he goes, but of course that isn't possible. And you're like, wait, in every single other book you've written, you've not said this, you've just said we have to do it. And he says, of course that's not possible. He says, think about Jesus. Jesus, maybe he could have been a really, really good carpenter. Maybe he could have been an excellent father or a great husband. Maybe he could have done all of these different things, but he didn't. So how did he decide? And he talks about the idea that he laid down some potentialities for the sake of that which has the greatest claim. And what is that has the greatest claim? It's the idea of self-giving love. And I find that really helpful as we think about authenticity. That authenticity and actualizing those potentials and engaging with them and being who we are actually needs to be centered in some way in that self-giving love, in the context of that. Now, self-giving love is something that has been problematic and has been badly used in some contexts. So sometimes the idea of self-giving love has been used to oppress certain groups of people. You know, you don't need to do that, dear. You just look after this. That's how you can show us your love. You know, don't be proud. I'm not being proud, I was just saying, hey, I could do that thing if you need. Do you know what I mean? So we need to be careful how we use self-giving love, because it's not about the denial of the self. It's about the giving of the whole of ourself, the whole of that self that we have brought to life, that unique God-inspired person, and bringing that and saying, how do I, this authentic person, love those around me? Does that make sense? So rather than a denial of who we are, it's embracing who we are and bringing that to the community and to those around us and engaging in that way. It's about being true to ourselves in an orientation towards others, which also prevents that authenticity from becoming narcissistic, from becoming all about me and all inward focused. Because if we think about it, an inward focused authenticity would not be a God-inspired self, because God is continually looking to out there, looking to outpour being, to outpour love, to create. So it's about looking beyond our own borders and looking towards others. And before I finish, and I promise I will finish, you've probably noticed that there are many issues, and I deal with these in chapter 8 of my book that is going to be published, and in a year you can all buy it and be like, oh, I missed all of those bits that she didn't talk about. Yeah, I like that. Tell my publisher I'm trying to sell it already. Authenticity has a privilege to it. There are some of us who, because of who we are, we can be authentic, because that authentic self is an authentic self that's reasonably accepted by the society around us and the places that we are. There are other places that it's harder to be our authentic self. If I was at the Atheist Society tonight talking about authenticity, I would find it harder to do in talking about the God-inspired self in that particular group. For some people who come to our churches, being authentic can be a really difficult thing. Whether it's about ethnicity, whether it's about history and experience. Many of our churches are pretty upper middle class a lot of the time, and it can be difficult for people to go, I can't afford those clothes that they're wearing. I can't do those things that they're doing. And to bring that authentic self. And then you've got issues around sexuality, issues I think around single mums, around young women who are pregnant, and all of those sorts of people who feel that they can't bring the whole of their authentic self. And it could be that they could, that they would be accepted, but that's not the perception that they have. So in many ways, being able to be authentic can be a privilege, and it can be dangerous to be authentic in some settings. If you're a gay person in Nigeria, best not to stand up and say that. There is a difference between being authentic and doing that well and just being a bit dumb, really, in terms of how we engage. There are some people that we can't trust with our whole authentic self. Being authentic doesn't mean telling everybody everything all the time. Skip that. Yeah, I do actually want to skip the next one and go on to the one after that. Thank you. So coming into land. The way that we engage with the world around us is important. And it's imperative that we, as people involved in Christianity, as people involved in the church, as people involved in theologizing, like we are here tonight, engage with what God is doing in our society. And don't just write off ideas, but think about them so that we're able to engage with what the Spirit of God is doing in the world around us. Because God doesn't confine God's actions just to the church. Sorry, God's got a bigger picture than that. Authenticity can be a really useful theological framework to think about personal identity when it's framed well. It can be really useful in our churches to think about and to engage with. I have a small group of young adults and I really enjoy meeting with them, but somehow they keep asking me questions that come back to my thesis, and it could be just that I'm really self-focused and that's all I'm thinking about. But I think there might also be something to it in terms of the way that people are engaging and thinking about what God is calling them to do and who God is calling them to be. And so we need to think about how we embrace the diversity that is around us as those involved in the church. Thinking about our own authenticity, but also thinking about how we make space for others in their authenticity, for their questions, for all of those sorts of things. So I am going to leave it there and open it up for any questions that people might have.
How does your concept of authenticity fit with the idea that we are being transformed, we are being renewed, and we are being changed into something else?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily frame it as we're being changed into something else. I would frame it as we're being changed into that which we're created to be, and that being authentic is being on that journey. We are not going to be able to be fully authentic now. And do you know what? In some ways, I think that if Jesus was to come back right now, we probably wouldn't be authentic immediately anyway. Because if there was going to be such a disconnect, and probably a disconnect more for me than for you good people, between who we are and who God has truly made us to be in that state, we wouldn't be the same people. It would be such a disconnect that identity would be just completely removed. So I think that that's something that God works with us on, and that transformation and that change is part of our own authentic becoming. Does that make sense?
Any other questions?
Yep, here comes one.
Thank you. That's really good stuff. What do you do when authenticity collides with what I'll call sociology? I'll give you a concrete example. You and I have been able to be authentic in terms of following our call and become ordained. We both know somebody who is prevented from doing that because her particular tradition has a barrier against that. Yet, so there is a frustrated authenticity. It's not even a personal choice to put something down, and it's something that should be picked up, potentially. Just interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that there are ways to do that, and again, it's the question of privilege within that, and privilege not only to show people who we are as authentic people, but to be fully that person. We were having a faculty retreat earlier this year, and one of the guys said, I don't even remember which one, it'd be a really interesting question at a retreat in the future to ask people, like, if there was a time in world history that you could have been alive, what would it be? And after a couple of minutes, the other women and I looked at each other and went, there is no time that we could have been alive and do the things that we are doing. You know, I was nearly 10 before my denomination started ordaining women in Australia. There is no other time. And I'm blessed to live in this time, and it's not all fixed. It is not all fixed. But there is privilege within that. And I think that sometimes, not for this particular person, sometimes it's putting things down or going, not now. Sometimes it's fighting for them. Sometimes it's finding ways around the system.
Thank you very much for an excellent analysis, and causes us to rethink who we really are. But your initial topic was to relate authenticity to the Christian mission, and the churches don't seem to be growing in authenticity, but declining. What would you say?
I think there is sometimes that gap between perception and reality, but I also think that you're right. There is a gap, and there are many issues going on. One of my friends did her doctoral work on young adults who have left the church and their spirituality. And what she expected to find is that they sort of had, as some people would put it, backslidden in their Christian faith. And instead she found out that a lot of them had grown more in their Christian life and their Christian walk and their reading of the Bible since they left the church than they did when they were in the church. It's not actually what she wanted to find, but it's what it came out as. And a lot of those people left the church because they didn't feel that they could be authentically them or would listen to within the church. So I think God's mission is moving more and more outside those bounds. And for me, the key would be that we need to look and see what God is doing in the world.
Yeah.
And then actually listen to people, theologize about that, as I hope I have laid some groundwork for with this particular topic for my generation, because I believe in many ways each of us need to be responding to our generation. I'm probably not the best person to reach your generation. You might not be the best person to reach mine, but I am my generation in many ways. And I can probably do that a little bit easier. There's less gap. And so how do we do that? And how do we missionally engage? And for me, sometimes that missional action is wearing my collar to the supermarket and having a question about that. Particularly if I'm wearing my collar and my rainbow earrings at the same time, really freaks people out.
Maybe just a couple more questions, then we better wrap it up.
Thanks, Christy. The idea of authenticity in some other cultures and in ours some time ago, and for some people today, is to stick to the orthodoxy. So to be authentic is not to ordain women in whatever tradition you happen to be in, or to be authentic is to do as your father did and do that trade, or all of those sort of. How does that relate to authenticity with our sort of obsession with individuality?
Yeah, it's a completely different thing. So this stream of authenticity has come out of romanticism and out of that sort of movement, and then existentialism, which would argue for kind of the individual over that. I think that it's possible to have, I think that for Christianity, there is more to authenticity than simply doing what has always been done. I think it requires, as Tillich said, going back and looking at what's there and then going, what is God saying to us today out of this? And so, yeah, but of course, this is culturally bound. It's come up out of something that has come up in Australian and other Western cultures. It's not a theology that would work super well in other areas of the world, and I don't want to try and make it that.
One last question. It's a question, David, isn't it?
Okay, well, I'll speak to the speaker later because I want to give it a theological something, but I think it's just the wrong time to do that. Look, I was going to say something that you might comment on how most of us are, the whole idea of authenticity I struggle with, and I've learned from you tonight, but most of us, including myself, are into persona and performance, even from the pulpit, and you haven't tonight, but from any situation. And when they went to get Jesus for the trial, the authorities didn't know who he was, and my understanding through meditation, contemplation, it could have been that he wasn't into persona and performance, he was himself. So Judas had to go and kiss him. So here's a man, a human being, who's evolved, I would say, to just be his authentic self. And that's what I think we're striving for, because corporations and other places where we work and churches and so forth demand a certain persona and a certain performance, and we need to strip that away. It's difficult, that could be. I'm sorry, that was a comment. I will never do it again.
We can have another question. No. Well, I don't think it's a kind of question, but I think it's a comment actually. I think there's something about Australian culture that I think connects with what is being said here tonight. And it's called being fair dinkum. It's
Yeah.
You want your water?
I do, thank you. It's thirsty work.
Well, thank you very much, Christy, for that brilliant presentation, which kept us all engaged the whole way through, I'm sure. Not only the content, but the way you ran it as well. And I think we can all learn a lot from the asides that you said throughout. And I do think what Jonathan just said about being fair dinkum, we all probably have a good role in a mission going back to our churches to kind of stimulate more fair dinkumness, if that's a word. And it seemed to me that I was sitting thinking, there are so many ramifications of what you talked about. It would be wonderful to draw a mind map and go here and where it relates and here. But I did think during the talk, a great person, Desmond Tutu, wrote about, I can only be me in relation to you being you. And that was a concept in his African style called Ubuntu. And I don't know, do people know about Ubuntu? U-B-U-N-T-U? Well, look it up on the internet, and especially in relation to Desmond Tutu, and it really resonates with what you talked about, authenticity in relation to other people. So, thank you for your presentation, and actually, Christy is currently on study leave, so I think it was great that she gave up some of her time to prepare this and to present tonight. So, now we do have supper, and the rules are that when you get a cup of coffee or tea, you need to sit down to drink it. So you can come back in here with it, or there are some chairs there. Now, next week is the last session for the year, and it's been decided earlier on that it will be a forum where there will be 4 speakers and 1 from each of the series throughout the year. And I do have a list somewhere of who they are. I might be able to...
Turn around and have a read.
Pardon? Oh, it's on the screen. There we are, the panellists. Vicky Balavansky, Norm Harden, Mario Trinidad and Sean Gilbert. And the idea is that each of them will speak for up to 7 minutes, where they might draw out some big issues from what they talked about when they presented before. And the whole idea of the forum is for us to think about big issues of our time. So each of the 4 presenters will present for 7 minutes. Then we will break into groups and we'll reflect on what they said, and we will formulate some questions about big issues as we see them in our time, and then the panel will answer those questions. So it should be a very interesting night, I reckon, and that will be the final session for this year. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next year.